Eudaimanya, systems and frameworks to improve habits, mind, and life.
Welcome to Eudaimanya, Atomic Habits. In this explainer, we're diving deep into a rigorous, faithful summary of James Clear's groundbreaking work. We're going to map out the actual mechanics behind lasting behavior change. You know, if you've ever felt completely stuck in a loop of bad habits, the problem isn't your willpower. It's really not. The problem is your system. So today, we're going to look clinically at how making tiny, marginal adjustments can mathematically guarantee exponential growth over time.
Okay, let's quickly look at our agenda. We'll be moving step by step through the catalyst, the 1% proposal, systems versus goals, identity-based habits, the 4 laws, and finally wrapping up with broad utility.
All right, part 1, the catalyst, the stakes of behavior change. To really understand this methodology, we have to recognize that behavioral change is inherently systemic. The author actually learned this the hard way after a horrific accident. He was hit directly in the face with a baseball bat. The impact literally shattered his eye sockets and put him in a medically induced coma. He started day 1 on a ventilator. It took him 8 grueling months just to return to basic motor patterns like walking in a straight line or driving a car safely. And yet 6 years later, he was named to the ESPN Academic All-America team. This incredible recovery wasn't some sudden miracle. It was the result of a meticulously applied system of tiny, consistent routines.
It proves that radical improvements are not born from massive, singular shifts. They come from the automatic repetition of small behaviors. So, what is a habit, really? It's just a routine performed regularly and, eventually, automatically. Building these small, consistent behaviors is the structural bridge that takes you from trauma to absolute triumph. They are the fundamental units, the atoms of any functional system.
Which brings us to part 2, the 1% proposal, the math of compounding habits.
The absolute core mathematical reality of this methodology revolves around making marginal, 1% improvements. This is actually the exact concept the British cycling team utilized to go from decades of absolute mediocrity to total Olympic dominance. They just optimized every tiny, seemingly insignificant aspect of riding a bike. But here's the catch, and this is why changing behavior feels so insanely difficult at first. The most powerful outcomes of compounding are delayed. You have to cross what's called a plateau of latent potential. You put in the work, you make those 1% adjustments, and for a while, nothing happens. You see no immediate results. This delay of gratification makes it statistically incredibly probable for people to just give up and revert to their old routines. But if you can push through that plateau, the math takes over. It is undeniable. If you get just 1% better each day for 1 year, the math dictates you will end up nearly 38 times better than when you started. On the flip side, a 1% daily decline drives you almost down to 0. It's an objective, mathematical trajectory.
Moving on to part 3, systems versus goals, reevaluating how we target success.
Now, to actually achieve that compound growth, we've got to completely shift our paradigm when it comes to systems and goals. We've all been conditioned to believe that huge success requires massive goals, but relying entirely on goals is like treating a symptom without ever addressing the underlying disease. Think about survivorship bias. We just assume a winner won because of their goal, but literally every Olympian wants the gold medal. The goal is identical. What actually differentiates the winners from the losers is their system. It's the continuous processes and the daily inputs that naturally lead to those results.
There's a quote here that perfectly anchors this whole concept. You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. To improve for good, you absolutely must solve your problems at the systems level, not the results level. Fix the inputs, and the outputs will literally fix themselves. Let's look at part 4, identity-based habits, the core of behavioral transformation. So, you might be wondering, why is it that even when we have a good system, we so often self-sabotage? Well, the psychological reason we fail to stick with habits is identity conflict. True change happens across 3 distinct layers: outcomes, processes, and identity. You might establish a shiny new goal, that's the outer outcome layer, but if you haven't changed the underlying beliefs of who you are at that core identity layer, the habits simply won't stick. You're basically trying to change your results without changing your perception of yourself.
If your behavior doesn't match your self-image, it will not last. The text gives a great example of this. A guy named Brian Clark stopped a lifelong, stubborn habit of nail biting. But he didn't do it by setting an outcome-based goal to just stop. Instead, he fundamentally shifted his self-image to view himself as a person with healthy nails. This methodology demands a profound shift. You have to move away from focusing on what you want to achieve and focus entirely on who you want to become.
All right, Part 5, the 4 laws, the practical framework for implementation.
Now we get to translate these psychological theories into concrete, actionable tools, the 4 laws of behavior change. Every single habit you have runs through a 4-step neurological loop: cue, craving, response, and reward. The cue triggers your brain to initiate the behavior. The craving is the motivational force behind it. The response is the actual habit you perform. And the reward is the end goal that satisfies that craving. The 4 laws map perfectly onto this biological feedback loop, giving us a framework to rigorously design good habits and systematically destroy bad ones.
The first law targets the cue, and it's simple: make it obvious. Before you can build a new habit, you have to establish awareness. Pull it out of the unconscious mind. The text details a fascinating pointing and calling system used by Japanese railway operators. They physically point at signals and vocalize their status to prevent accidents. It literally forces a subconscious action into conscious awareness. To apply this in your own life, you need deliberate environment design. Say you want to practice guitar more. Don't leave it hidden in the closet. Place it squarely in the middle of your living room. The visual cues for your good habits must be glaringly obvious.
The second law targets the craving: make it attractive. Human biology is heavily driven by dopamine. It's the anticipation of a reward that actually compels us to act. So to build a system, you have to frame your habits to maximize their appeal. Conversely, to destroy a bad habit, you just invert this law, make it unattractive. You do this by deliberately and vividly highlighting the physical, financial, or psychological costs of that negative behavior. You want to short-circuit the craving before it even has a chance to start.
Now for the third law, which targets the response, make it easy. From an evolutionary standpoint, human behavior strictly follows the law of least effort. We inherently want to conserve energy. So you must redesign your environment to drastically reduce the friction associated with good habits. The absolute most actionable tool here is the 2-minute rule. Scale down any new habit until it takes under 2 minutes to execute. Instead of planning to read a whole chapter of a book, plan to read just one single page. It sounds almost ridiculously easy, right? But it reduces the friction so much that it forces you out of the mere planning phase and into actual, concrete action.
Finally, the 4th law targets the reward. Make it satisfying. To make a habit stick, completing the loop has to be immediately rewarding. But to break a bad habit, failure must be immediately painful. There's an amazing historical example here, referencing the author Victor Hugo. He literally locked away all his formal clothes, so he physically couldn't leave the house, forcing himself to stay inside and write The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He created a wildly strict commitment mechanism. Using tools like habit contracts ensures that the cost of failing your system is immediate and highly unsatisfying, which effectively closes that neurological loop.
Let's wrap up with Part 6, broad utility, where the atomic system applies.
So who is this systemic breakdown of behavior actually for? Well, the beauty of focusing on atomic units is that the math is infinitely scalable. It functions absolutely seamlessly across the board. Whether you're an entrepreneur optimizing your testing and hiring systems, a coach refining daily practice rhythms, an individual targeting health and finances, or a family looking to build lasting collective routines. Because these 4 laws are mapped directly to human neurology, they dictate behavioral responses across absolutely all environments.
As we conclude this explainer, take a hard look at your own daily routines. Ask yourself, do they mathematically align with the identity you're trying to establish? Prioritizing localized, temporary goals over continuous systems is basically an operational failure. Remember, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. Start small, optimize that 1%, and trust the mechanics of atomic habits.
If this video was useful, give it a like, subscribe, and share. More systems and frameworks in the next Eudaimanya video.